we're talking, or we've been sort of following along the line of the importance of getting the most important thing in life as the most important thing, and that is being able to walk with God in such a way as you make it to the end and you finish well. And if you don't do that, then what's been the whole point of a journey that never finished? A journey that started and went astray is worse than someone who never started a journey. So to gain the wisdom of how to walk with God becomes like the most important thing in life. To walk with God, then all will be well ultimately. And you really don't have a problem in the world. To not walk with God is to curse your life with so many problems and end up with making worse ones as you make poor decisions. So it's pretty vital. And we talked about maturity, I guess, is you don't just become mature overnight, but maturity is what happens. It's where you end up from having walked a certain way. And that way is a way of humility in the sense of understanding yourself in a very healthy way, and walking with God in understanding who he is in your life and how much you need him, and a fixedness of heart and mind and purpose upon God and his ways, and choosing that on a constant basis, choosing regularly, and most importantly, renewing your love day by day and understanding that's how it works. And the place, if you walk that way, then the place you end up is mature. It's you don't arrive there today or tomorrow. There's no point at a time when you arrive there. That's just where you end up, walking that way. Now, for many of you, if you understand seasons, and one of the most important things in life is also understanding a season and cooperating with that season and going with it. So whatever purpose there was that God had for that season is achieved. And so you're able to move into the next season of life that God has for you. And many of you are young singles, where one of the most critical parts of your season is figuring it all out. Figuring out who you are and what your purpose is, and getting clarity at that point. And if you are able to really nail those two down, then you can move ahead into the next season really, really, really well. And if you don't, you end up getting stuck back there. Thumbs up if you understand what I mean by getting stuck back there. It just means that you don't grow, and you become unaware that you haven't grown. You're in this sort of unaware bubble, and you start to, all sorts of things start to kick in. Now, we're just going to over to Brig. He's just going to share some thoughts on understanding what's going on in his season.
Thanks, Paul. Just going to change this. There we go. Much better. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so just to get started with this, one of the last couple of months, I certainly have been asking these questions, and I've been very challenged in that to really work out where and how I want to live life. And one of the main things that keeps coming to mind as I've been preparing is a scripture in Corinthians, I believe, but it's a warning that Paul gives out. He says, "Take heed lest you fall." And I've seen that, and I've observed that as being a genuine warning. As you go through life will get busy and life will get complicated. That it's, for myself, I've seen that it would be easy to shift away from the things that I've learned. So for me, most of my journey from start till, well, now and going forward, I'm sure, has been heavily involved in discipleship. I've learned a lot. I've been taught a lot. I've molded a lot of things that I've imitated in my life. So the way how I basically live life, I've been taught that life is about giving and not receiving. I've been taught the significance of serving people. I've been taught the significance of laying my life down for others. I've been taught the significance of seeking first the kingdom. So all of these things I've been taught, and I've learned them, and they've all became a model of my life, and I've embraced them as a good way to live life, because I can see the good in that. I can see the fruit that it brings out, and I can see how I want that for my life. Now, the challenge that as I began to ask these questions and as I began to seek all of these things during this journey, I've asked myself the question, will I still live the same way if, like if I was no longer in those relationships, like if Nia and Phil went around, or if Paul and Rosie went around, will I still live the same way? Would I still pursue the same things? Or would another influence come in and that would distract me from the things that I've learned? Like, how much of those things have I fully embraced and have taken hold of them as part of my life, that I've thought about them, I've considered them, they now make a part of who I am. So as I'm considering these things and I'm asking myself the question, if I were 90 years old and I've lived my life, would I be able to look back and say, I've lived life well? Or would I have regrets that I've missed the point? Or have I missed what God really intended for me? And I find that it's easy to end up in that position if I don't actually consider how I want to live. As I'm seeing my current stage and my current season is, excuse me, like life is getting busier. So get busier with work, like family dynamics would change, relational dynamics would change, everything would get busy. And I can see how that ultimately becomes a distraction. That's one of the things that would shift me away from truth, because I now have to, focus a lot more on financial stress that may come up. So I have to focus a lot of my energy into that. And with that, then divert my life from the thing that I've considered. And I can see how easy that will be if I haven't fully considered those things myself. And when, family, like relational dynamics change and there's children to look after, and they will get busy again. And that in itself would also become another major part in life that could divert my attention from the things of God. So at the moment, these things are easy for me to look at because I don't necessarily have those issues, but the things that I can foresee that if I don't seriously consider those things now, then it's easy to be able to actually wind away from the truth. It's easy to see how I can actually miss the point and live my life and then just get taken on a different path, but never realize that I've missed where I actually intended to go. So at the moment, for me to ask these questions, to see, okay, God, where would you have me go? What do I truly want in my life? Where do I truly want to end up? Because I acknowledge that, yes, life will get busy, and yes, things will get more demanding, and I may go off track once in a while along the way. But if I know and I'm solid within myself of where I want to end up, if I have that deep conviction that is within me, that is fully thought through, is fully considered, I've answered the questions and I've given myself fully to it, even though I may wander off when life gets busy, I'll have a lighthouse, I have an anchor that actually holds me to something that is true, that when I do reassess my life, or when I do consider things, I can see where I would have gone wrong. I can see where I would have missed the mark. But if I live life without that in place, if I live life without fully considering or thinking through where I want to go, I don't see much hope for myself to be able to actually go back to something, because whatever gets my attention, that becomes my new normal. And without knowing the way of how I actually set to live life, I have no way of changing my new normal, because, well, that is now my normal. So that's been my season of actually really asking these questions and considering, where do I actually want my life to end, and how do I want to live to be able to make sure that it does end up there. And when I do get distracted along the way, I now have a point of reference that can always take me back to actually knowing, hey, Brig, this is what you consider, this is how you wanted to live. So let's go back to that, as opposed to being a aimless wanderer, because I feel that's a sure way for me to waste my life, and I don't want to do that. But yeah, that's been my journey, and that's been my processing.
Out of curiosity, how many, just thumbs up, how many had these thoughts and wondered these things. I remember as a young Christian having these thoughts. You know, one of the scariest things for us as young Christians was it was quite observable that when people in their singlehood were fully about the work of the Lord and the Lord's affairs, and what we observed was, for many, if not most, when they got married and had kids, it was like they weren't like that anymore. It was like, well, that was for singles. That was when we were young and radical, or that was when, wow, weren't we on fire back then? And oh, now we're not like that because we are grown up and mature. And like, oh, goody, look what we've got to look forward to, losing our love for the Lord and our zeal. Ooh. It was not necessarily encouraging. To see older ones that never lost their love and their zeal and their purpose was just so, it was like a beacon of hope. Look, it's achievable. Look, there's some that survive. Maybe we can too. Do you remember those days?
Yeah, we met a few coming up here that was quite.
Oh, when you meet saints still alive when they're older, it just gives you the hope that, yes, this is how to walk.
Actually, we met a few up here.
Yeah.
We sort of.
Yeah. This is where they all went. You know, like, yeah, that's right. I remember that. And it is wonderful. But obviously, if somebody doesn't have that hunger and zeal to be all out for the Lord and to serve the Lord in their singleness, it is really scary. What chance have they got of, when life is truly testing, to hang on to something they barely got a hold of when they were single? I mean, that's a fair call, is it not? And what Briggs said is quite true. Borrowed purpose can't be maintained throughout an entire lifetime. Often what people think are convictions are simply untested opinions that they thought were opinions. And when those convictions were washed away by a new norm, they genuinely can now look back and realize, well, that was just an opinion I had back then, and I just called it a conviction because I was just very zealous and I thought I was absolutely right. And it's on this point that I'd like to talk a bit more about today. I was reading through 1 Corinthians 13 on a new take. So I don't want you to think of 1 Corinthians 13 and the love chapter. Okay, nobody's getting married today. Okay, and so we're not really going down the whole sentimental line of, you know, let's listen to these words, you know, the words that none of us have any intention of actually keeping, and just simply say, well, that's a nice ideal. Okay, I'll stop right there. But I just want you to, well, here's my take. Roz and I have had time to think, and anyone that's older, they get a lot of time to reflect upon how they've lived their life and the things that have not been helpful, and the things where they thought they were right and they realized they were not right. And I think it's very helpful for younger ones to listen to older ones when they say that sort of thing. I would pick on 3 things that are hard to see. Our religiousness, our stuff, and our selfishness. And how blind they make us and the price we pay for that. I think we're going to be talking a bit about this stuff in the next couple of weeks and understanding it more and unpacking it. But Paul sort of was talking to a group of people that were very zealous and were very into their religion, and they thought that they were so right. And Paul tries to pull them up and said, listen, guys, you're missing the whole point. I'm just abbreviating 1 Corinthians 13 real quick. And he says, listen, all these things are great, but you're missing the point. He says, you guys haven't learnt to love yet. So you actually don't have anything. You've missed the point. And he says, when I was a child, you know, it's like but first of all, he says, look, you only know a little bit. He said to them, you only know a little bit. Now we see in part. There'll come a time when you can see fuller, but you got to understand you only know in part. Don't think you've got it all together. He says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. And he says, now you see but a poor reflection. Now, just to give you, as if a man in a mirror, and just so you help you understand the picture, they didn't have mirrors like you have mirrors. They had polished metal mirrors, and polished metal mirrors had dimples and bumps. I suppose you've seen mirrors that make you look fat in dressing rooms. No, never. I'm sure they make you look skinny, and that's a distortion, okay? But those ones, if you looked into their mirrors, I think the whole left-hand side of my face just got bigger because you moved into a dimple. And it was a poor reflection. It wasn't like your mirror. It was a poor reflection. And Paul was trying to say, you know, when you look at life and when you look at yourself, you're not going to get the full picture. There's a lot about you that you don't actually know. That's what he's trying to say. And you should be a little bit humbled about that. And you should not get on your religious high horse and go around judging other people and thinking you've arrived, because there's so much that you don't know. You have to understand that the person who called you is an infinite God that is well past your ability to fully comprehend. And you need to keep him knowable and yet mysterious at the same time. You need to understand that he's not shallow, and you can't arrive. And you can't, and people are always falling into the trap of being able to, and I have done this in the past, where you feel like you've got it all sorted out and you've got all your ducks in a row, and now you're believing the right things, and now you can feel secure that you've nailed it. And there is a wonderful sense and security. That's what most people are into in religion. They're after something that is so secure and so locked down that it makes them feel, I'm okay, I've got it. And Paul's simply challenging that, and he says no. And in fact, that's, in a sense, that's childish. Look, I can look back on my life and I can see how religious I have been, and yet I have been zealous, and yet I've loved God, and yet I thought I had it right and I had it so wrong. And I thought I was balanced and I was imbalanced, and I thought I was right and I didn't know what spirit that I was of. And it's just, us in the religious circles are terribly notorious at being blind to ourselves. As long as and what justifies it is the things that we're believing are just so right. Jesus didn't pick on the Pharisees for their doctrine. He was picking on them for what they couldn't see. And what they believed blinded them from what they should have been able to see, and that was their own hearts, and how they just didn't get God. You know, like Ros and I have just thought through things, and our priorities over life have changed so much, and now we feel like more than ever, we haven't arrived, but you feel like now I think the only thing that's important is actually becoming like God, like Jesus, learning to love because I've loved so poorly, learning to walk with humility because I've been so proud and I thought I was right, and my opinions were strong, and I just struggled to understand other people. I struggled to listen, and I was so quick to think I was right and to put judgments on other people and see them as wrong. And I was so wrong myself, and now I can see that. And all that matters is walking humbly with God, or living dependently upon him, or displaying some of his characteristics and wanting to have them in your life and trying to learn to keep step with him. And that's all that matters. And you think, hang on, I've only discovered that that's all that matters. So where was my head at for the first 35 years of thinking I was walking with God? Well, now I'm trying to walk with God, but back then, what was I doing? What was my religion made up of? And you think, I don't know where my head was at. But that's what Paul's trying to say now. That was like a child. And maturity, or coming out of childhood, is understanding these are the things that really, really, really matter. And one of the keys in understanding that is actually seeing yourself and understanding your stuff. And so, you know, and I look back on my religiousness. I remember looking back. I remember the day I became a Calvinist and I understood right doctrine. I understood the true way of salvation, the true nature of man, the true nature of God, the true nature of the gospel. And I had it figured out. I had all my ducks in a row and they're all aligned right. Their beaks were aiming straight ahead. It was all perfect and I understood it. And so I thought I'd ring up this guy who was like a mentor for me in many ways when I first became a Christian. And his name was Tom Carson. Tom and Cecily Carson, they were. Old Tom and Cecily, they were so straight-laced, but they were wicked people. They were the first ones that got it. They got me addicted to tea. It wasn't me. They did. They
weren't wicked though.
They did bring out a pot of tea every time I came over, and since then I've just, anyway, that's how it is. But they were lovely, and Cecily was so sweet, and I thought they were fantastic, and I hadn't seen him for so long, and I rang him up one day because I was so excited that I'd figured my doctrine out, and I remember talking to him. I don't know why I rang him up, but I said, "Listen, I figured it out." Boom, 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 and his response was like he only taught me years later when I realized how clueless I really was. And what he was saying, how he responded to me, well, that's great, Paul. As for me, I'm still figuring it out. There were so many things I haven't figured out. And he was so indefinite. And I was so definite. And he was so indefinite. I felt sorry for him. I felt, wow, he's got a long way to go. But he was displaying humility. And he was realizing the older he got, the less he knew. And I just hit that pinnacle where I just knew everything, you know. And years later, I look back and I thought, wow, he's a very godly man. And not only that, there was so much. I didn't realize, but he was the hero and the champion of the entire Brethren movement. He'd get up at 4 o'clock every morning and spend 4 hours in the Word, day by day, every day, and somehow become like the Lord. And he was the hero in Bible teaching in the entire movement in Australia. And I had no idea, but I was teaching him, of course, you know, I knew best. So anyway, that was interesting when I look back. I could never ring him up now unless I got a telephone call to heaven and say, Tom, you were right, you were right. But nevertheless, you look back and you think your religiousness, you're so often in a religious spirit without knowing it. One of the keys is realizing that you have stuff. You have religious stuff and you have stuff that you don't know you have. All of us have issues. Every single one of us have issues, and you have issues, and you have issues that you've seen and you have dealt with, and you have a lot of issues you haven't seen yet and you haven't dealt with yet, and they muck up your religion and you can't see that. It's one of those things that, but what it does is when you realize that, it tempers you and you get a bit of humility about you, whether you're less judgy on other people, less harsh on other people, and it makes it easier to walk with God in humility. And it makes it easier to walk with other people without burdening yourself with all these issues about other people. And it makes it easier to let go of offenses. Do you know Christians are the most notorious people for picking up offenses, and the longer you live, the more you can pick up and they can burden your walk. And it just gets too hard to walk with God with all that sort of baggage. But to drop it all off and to not carry any of it and realize you just can't afford to carry it. You don't want to carry it. And your journey in life is to learn not to carry that. And to forget about other people. You just realize you can't and you don't want to. And to see the importance of that is growing up and leaving childish ways. And so it's another area that I guess you could say there's three things. There's our religiousness and our stuff, our identity stuff, but all sorts of other stuff in our life that we'll talk on more over the next couple of weeks. But it's also our selfishness. It's like when I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. I acted like a child. Now, with children, there's some beautiful characteristics of children, but the fact is people are at their most selfish when they're either a young child or they're really, really, really old. And as a young child, one of the things about children is that they're cute, they're ever so cute, but they're all ever so on about themselves. And when they come to the table, they're not bringing anything for anybody else. They haven't prepared anything for anybody else. When they come to a dinner table, they just bring themselves with an expectation. That's a child. An adult is someone who prepares a table for somebody else. A child is someone who takes. An adult is someone who's learnt to give. A child is someone who doesn't take responsibility for their own life, for their own state, for their own relationships. A child is someone, when they get a sore finger, all of a sudden that soreness is all that matters, and they're so thoroughly unaware of anybody else in the world or any other need in the world but their sore finger. I must admit there are a few adults like that too, isn't there? So understanding that selfishness is really steeped in childishness. It reminds me of a poem that I read one. Please excuse me, I'm on tea theme today. I gave a little tea party this afternoon at 3. It was very small, 3 guests in all. I, myself, and me. Myself ate up the sandwiches while I drank all the tea. 'Twas also I who ate the pie and passed the cake to me. Meaning I'm just filled with myself. And my thoughts are about myself. And I don't know I'm thinking about myself. It's my normal. And I don't know that this is childish because I'm a child. And I'm stuck in my little bubble. And some people never grow up. You know, the church could be accused of being an orphanage filled with adult children. If you could picture that. So, but then again, they can excuse themselves because the preacher comes along and he preaches a message on 1 Corinthians 13 and how we should all love one another and we shouldn't be so selfish. So then they attempt to be good to someone else and do some kind acts, sort of like packing a lunch and going out and having a picnic. And after coming back for this wonderful picnic, you come back to home and the picnic is what you're not and home is who you are. They live selfishly with occasional acts of kindness to justify living selfishly. And they call that the Christian life. You may not even realize this. You might be doing this. You might be struggling to grow up without knowing it. One of the keys to growing up is deciding that you do want to grow up. How quickly people mature, how quickly people grow when they actually do realize they've been a child and they actually work out what they want and they want to grow up. And then from there, it's a very accelerated journey. And I guess you could say, so putting childish ways behind you is beginning a journey into maturity. Let me just read you a little simple quote from Herbert Keller. Childhood reveals tendencies. Youth develops personality. Maturity establishes character. Childhood reveals tendencies. Youth develops personality. And maturity develops character. So maturity is coming out of childhood and into the fullness of who you were meant to be. And he is only advancing in life whose heart is getting softer, whose blood warmer. In other words, he's learning to love. His brain quicker and his spirit entering into living peace. You actually can't mature unless you start to face your stuff, realize you have stuff, realize to face your stuff and get answers and having the courage to go on And we're going to unpack that a lot more. But that keeps you stuck in childhood. And you might think to face stuff is to admit that you're a child, but you don't realize that's your passage into maturity. And from a past experience, until you have the courage to face what is there. And the funny thing is, only when you really choose to have the courage to face what's there, you seem to wake God up. And all of a sudden, that whole area he gets very active in that area. And so you don't realize you give God the signals to take you on an area. And if you don't give God the signals, wouldn't it be horrible to think that you were waiting for God when God was waiting for you and you never grew up in your entire life? That is a waste of a life. I hope you pick that up. Do you know, doing nothing for others is the undoing of one's self. We must be purposefully kind and generous, or we miss the best part of existence. The heart that goes out of itself gets large and full of life. We do ourselves the most good in doing something for others. And that's so true. Some people just remain children because they are just simply too obsessed. And if they turn around and know that and do nothing about that, call it what you like, but you can't really call it following Christ, can you? So these are some thoughts, and I look back on my own life and I've seen my own religiousness with the best intentions. And I think I've been in every religious trap you can fall into. I'm not sure, maybe there's others that we haven't. I haven't tried the backslidden trap. I don't know. I don't think I want to try that one. I don't want that one. No. It's like a slow death. But I do realize the growth that happened in me when I faced my stuff. And I had stuff. And I didn't know that I had stuff. And I know the growth that happened in me when I faced my own selfishness. And I know the growth that happens when I was prepared to see how religious that I'd been and the trap that all was. And I've come to a place of seeing what really matters. Isn't it weird? You come to this place of faith, hope, and love are all that matters. So they're on the top of this pinnacle of a mountain, and they mean everything. And every other truth you've ever thought that you thought was important now bows down to them lower down on the mountain. And that's how the priorities all work. These were up there and these were all down here. And you figured like, okay, I think this is how God intended it to be. I just took a long time in getting it, but I think this is right. This is where I want to be now. And I don't really want to change. And these things will be challenged for the rest of your life, but you know this is God taught. And we just pray that you don't have to spend a lifetime learning these things and feeling like, well, what did I do with all the rest of it? When from the beginning, Paul was telling you, well, actually, these things really matter and you got to figure this out. And this is your passage into maturity, realizing that these are the things that matter. Micah 6:8 says that he has shown you, oh man. And what does the Lord require of you? Stop and think. What he's going to say now is really, really important. To act justly, like to treat people well, and to love mercy. The only person that loves mercy who has practiced it enough to see its virtues, and now they appreciate it. And to walk humbly with your God. And whoever wrote that, they would have spent a lifetime figuring that out and wrote it down so that other people don't have to spend a lifetime figuring that out at the end and wishing they could live their life again. The wisest amongst you can be the youngest who actually get it. That's your opportunity. that ball is in your court. What do you want to do with it? Another thing about childhood, and I'll finish here, is that their thinking is very simplistic. It's very gappy. It sees little bits here and there, thinks it sees it all, and it's very, very clunky. It doesn't see the whole picture. A child doesn't see the whole picture. They don't get a broadened perspective, seasoned by life experience and standing back a bit. They're so close and they're so subjective in a very small bubble, and their perspective is very small, but in their head, that's all they know in their existence. And that's the thinking of a child. Becoming mature is not becoming liberal. It's just being on God's page and seeing what is truly important and what is not as important. It's learning to not swallow camels and not worry about gnats. And if you don't know what that means, ask Phil. He'll tell you what that means. So, Lord, each one is at a different place, but your truths are universal, and we ask that you would teach each one what they need to hear from all of this. Whether it's facing their stuff, facing their selfishness, or their religiousness, and that you would take each one of us onto maturity. And in the end, we'd all meet in glory and saying, yes, Paul was right. The only things that really mattered were faith, hope, love. Amen.